Thanks, Dave. This morning we were talking about multinational companies, transnational corporations, and of course the only reason for their existence is to make money, is to maximise their profits. And one of the ways they've found to maximise those profits and remove all obstacle blockbuster free trade agreements. And the impetus for these free trade agreements comes not from separate governments, it comes from these corporations themselves, who wield an enormous amount of influence throughout the world. John Hillary here is an expert on these matters and is going to talk about some of these deals such as TTIP and CISA. So with that, I'll hand you over to John.
Bert, thank you so much. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here. War on Want, for those of you who don't know us, we come out of the labour movement. We were born in the 1950s out of a desire for a better, a fairer world from the socialist tradition, but working very closely with trade unions around the world. All of the major trade unions in this country are affiliated to War on Want. We're all proud to be trade union members. Most of us Unite members, but some from other places as well. And we work very closely with trade unions and women's associations in different parts of the world in the workplace. It's not the only part of our internationalism. We also work for the liberation of Palestine, for occupied Western Sahara, and for many other issues. But I'm really pleased to be here today because the issue of trade and how that affects workers' rights is absolutely central to the work over many, many decades. And from my own side, as Bert has said, I've worked for the last 20 years looking at the impact of these so-called free trade agreements on people, particularly looking at the impact on workers' rights, on jobs, on industrial development, and seeing that by and large free trade agreements have been fantastic if you're a big transnational corporation and pretty rubbish if you're anybody else. That's the starting point that we'd come from. And there is quite a lot of historical evidence which is now there as to what the impact of the free trade deals and trade. Remember, when they say free trade, your first question has to be free for whom? Who's getting this freedom out of it? There's a very, very good Nicaraguan farmer who I remember once speaking at one of these things saying, free trade for you means putting us in chains. And I think that summed it up very well. The impact of these free trade deals and the trade liberalisation across the world has been pretty similar in all cases where it's been rolled out. And War on Want, we did a particular study trying to bring together all of the information, looking at what the impact had been in country after country. We were looking particularly here at the impact in Africa and in Latin America as a result of the 1980s and the 1990s, when structural adjustment programs proposed by the World Bank and the IMF forced open the markets of those countries. And you saw the same thing time and time again. Deindustrialization. You're basically bringing local firms into direct competition with the big transnational corporations, and the impact's always the same. You can't compete with Siemens, the big German powerhouses, and they end up losing hundreds of thousands of smaller firms and millions of jobs. And even if you haven't lost the jobs, the increased competition means that the terms and conditions for all the workers are pushed down and down and down. And that has been the uniform experience of free trade agreements, of trade liberalisation around the world. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about this new generation of trade deals which is coming up now and is being rolled out across the entire planet. And after I've done that and given a bit more of a sense of the content of them, I want to end with a bit of a political discussion, because there's some quite interesting politics within the international labour movement, which I hope will then perhaps stimulate some more of the discussion that we'll have immediately afterwards. The politics is quite complex on this, but it's really important because the internationalism which binds together the labour movement in all countries has been shattered by free trade agreements. and by the different positioning of trade union bodies vis-à-vis free trade. So that's going to be the discussion bit, the politics at the end. But as I say, there's a new generation of trade deals which is now being rolled out. If you think about the 80s and 90s, that was like a sort of a practice run, if you want, for what's now being seen around the world. And it's a whole mass of different acronyms and new sort of names for them. For us in Europe, there's a particular interest at the moment in the EU deal, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP as it's called. And I've brought copies of a booklet which we put out on this. All of these things are available online. I can call up various websites for you to see. Actually, I've put them here already. So if you ever want to get any of the things, we put all of our stuff online. That's the older study. This is the new one. And when we come to the politics, I can talk to you a bit more about some things to read on that. TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, you might think to yourself, well, I'm not from Europe, I'm not from the USA, why is it of interest to me? They're saying that TTIP is the blueprint, it's the template, it's the model for all future trade deals around the world. And that's why I'm going to go into it a little bit more detail, because they're specifically saying we will negotiate this between the European Union and the USA, and then everybody else will be forced to sign up to what's in it. So that's why we're saying it's important. Think of the World 95 tried to do the same thing. But as a result of worldwide resistance, of the global justice movement working together with negotiators from the global south inside the WTO, stop it. And all of the worst bits of the WTO were kicked out in 2004. And ever since they've been bumbling along, and as you know, in Nairobi, this try and see if they can salvage something from the WTO round. But then they're not getting anywhere with these big multilateral deals. Let's do a deal behind closed doors, in secret, between the European Commission, the unelected, bureaucrats who rule the European Union, and the US government. No parliamentarians are allowed to see any of the text of what's going on. We only get what we get through leaks, and the US government has said nobody is allowed to see texts at all until it's completely finished, and it's about TTIP and this new generation of other deals, which I'm going to come on to, is that it expands the free trade agenda. In the past, it was all about getting rid of tariffs at the border. So let's say we will drop our tariff on steel if you drop your tariff on coffee. We will drop our tariff on cars if you drop your tariff on bananas. And that was the way in which it worked from the period, from the end of the Second World War onwards. But this new generation of deals is going much further. It's not just talking about tariffs, but it's going by the border and saying we want to re-engineer your society so that business gets a free hand to operate as it wishes. So that there can be the maximum accumulation of capital, the maximum profits for business who don't want to have to deal with the sort of social and environmental issues that we would like them to deal with. So the first pillar of TTIP, there are three main pillars of TTIP. The first pillar is deregulation. They said quite explicitly at the beginning, we want to get rid of the regulations that act as barriers to trade. And we thought, well, what do they mean? What are they talking about in terms of these regulations? And then conveniently, they gave us a list. And at the top of the list, labour standards. Of course, if you're an American corporation, of course you don't want to have to deal with European labour standards. In the US, they don't even have the right to paid holiday. Whereas here, we do have that right. We fought for that right over many, many decades and decades, and we hold it dear. So deregulation is about getting rid of the labour standards and allowing business to have free rein to trade and invest without having to worry about workers' rights. It's about, minimum wages, for example. Why does a corporation want to have to deal with minimum wages? Let alone a living wage? No. And the whole idea of free trade agreement says you put downward pressure on those things And gradually you free transnational capital from having to deal with all of these regulations. Environmental standards equally, they screaming out saying, why should we have to abide by the big environmental standards in Europe, which we don't have to in the USA? And they're saying, why should we have to do that in the world? So deregulation is the first pillar. The second pillar is privatization. And this has been standard in trade deals all the way back to the 1990s. The idea that you have to force open new markets so that capital can have access to them, so that the private sector can take over the role of the public sector. And that's absolutely standard across the world wherever you see it. But you might think, well, look, our own government is already privatising quite a lot of things. A lot of us have that battle to try to get things back into public hands or to stop them being privatised. So what's different about a trade deal? The answer is, if you have a privatised public service inside a trade deal, you can't get it back again. The idea is, the whole point about free trade agreements is that you guarantee to transnational corporations that those markets will remain open to them forever. So that's what's the extra danger, the extra threat from these big trade deals. And we've seen that in the past. South Africa was an interesting example. When South Africa was looking at water privatisation, it was flirting with water privatisation. It was saying, okay, let's see if we can get some foreign participation in. And they gradually found that water privatisation is really bad news. Like it's been found almost everywhere. Just throws miles higher tariffs, much higher rates for people, and eventually the poor can't afford it, and you get defaults, and then the foreign company has to leave again. It's a fairly standard thing. So I remember meeting with one of the ministers in South Africa 15 years ago when South Africa was experimenting with water prices. He said, look, we don't know if it's going to work. We don't know if it's going to be a disaster. So even though we might want to try it out here, we're never going to put it in a trade deal. Because if you put it in a trade deal, you don't get to learn from your mistakes. You basically have to make the same mistake. So the second pillar is privatization. But the third pillar is perhaps the most outrageous new element within this new generation of trade and investment deals. And that's a special power for transnational corporations to be able to sue national governments for any policy that is brought in that can undermine their right to maximise profit in the future. And this goes under the rather unappealing name of investor-state dispute settlement. Investor-state dispute settlement, so ISDS is the way in which it's shortened. What it means, basically, is you're now treating these foreign companies as if they have the same status as the nation state. Because in traditional trade policy, at the WTO, for example, if you want to take a case out against a country's trade policy, you have to be a country. So Brazil challenged China, or India can challenge France, or, as it did do, Antigua challenged the USA. But you can only do that if you're a country to a country. What this is saying is that foreign corporations can get that. Foreign corporations can now have their own parallel justice system, which is not available to anybody else. It's not available to people. It's not available to domestic companies. It's certainly not available to governments. But it's only available to foreign corporations to be able to sue the country in which they're operating if they introduce any new public policy law which they don't like. And Egypt is already facing this challenge from the French company Veolia, which is known for many people for many other sins, whether it be in Palestine or anywhere else. But it's being sued, the state of Egypt is being sued because it dared to raise the minimum wage. It raised the minimum wage, and Veolia said, well, we've got a contract to collect the bins in Alexandria, and if you start raising the minimum wage and requiring us to pay all our workers more, that means that our expectations, which is the legal word under the trade law, our legitimate expectations to maximise our profits in the future have been torn up. So they're now suing them. Successful case been brought against countries where they've tried to reverse unpopular privatizations. There's one in Europe, Slovakia. I don't know if anyone here from Slovakia? No? Well, if they were, they would know exactly what I'm talking about. The government in Slovakia previously had privatized the health service, and a Dutch company had come in and started making good profits out of it. It was very unpopular, and so a new party ran for election on a platform saying, we will reverse that privatization. We will bring the health sector back into public hands. They were immediately sued, because they got into power and they did this. They were immediately sued by a Dutch company, Achmea, who was found to be right and awarded 22 million euros in compensation because their right to make profit out of the people of Slovakia took precedence over the democratically elected government and its decision to reverse the privatization. And this is now being seen again and again and again. Germany, for example, is being sued by another Swedish company. Why? Because in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, you remember 2011, the Fukushima nuclear disaster blew out, the tsunami came in, 20,000 people lost their lives. The second only ever nuclear disaster to hit the top level of nuclear disaster after Chernobyl. And the German people, who've long disliked nuclear power, went out onto the streets in hundreds of thousands and they said, we're not going to have nuclear power in the future. And the government said, you're right, we're not, it's too dangerous. And by the year 2022, there will be no more nuclear power in Germany. And you think, good, because they're all switching to renewables, and that's quite a good thing to do. They're now being sued for billion euros, 5,000 million euros, because one of these Swedish companies says, we had plans. We had plans to make money out of the nuclear power industry well beyond 2022. So if you're closing down that market, you need now to pay us off. And this is the challenge to democracy. All of our leaflets on TTIP say democracy for sale. Because basically this is it. You no longer have the right as a sovereign people to decide what you want, labour rights, your environmental rights, and your social standards for the future. Now, that power to sue companies already exists in many other bilateral investment treaties. And that's a lot of the examples we have come from other treaties around the world where companies have used this power already to sue governments. But what's interesting is, in many countries around the world, governments are now saying, we've learned. We no longer want anything to do with this. So India, South Africa, Indonesia have all said we're terminating these agreements now. We no longer want to give foreign companies this right. Many countries of Latin America have said we never even got involved in the first place. South Africa said, we definitely want nothing to do with this. Why? Because one of the black empowerment policies was successfully challenged by an Italian mining company who said, we don't have to. Under the trade law, we don't have to give affirmative rights to South African people simply because you have the legacy of apartheid you want to get over. Trade, free trade, says we don't have to abide by that. So the South African government has also said, we want nothing more to do with this in the future. It's really important as a massive wave of resistance, which is now building across the world saying, we don't want anything more to do with this. And in fact, now it's just hitting 12 o'clock here in Britain, means it's 1 o'clock in Strasbourg, and the European Parliament is voting this moment on whether or not to allow this power in through TTIP. So when we finish this, we're all going to start tweeting and seeing what's happened actually in the real world. Not the final vote on this, but it's the vote where they're actually trying to say, should we allow this new power for corporations in Europe? It's not just EU-USA. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is what President Obama is doing, looking west across the Pacific Rim. Latin American countries, Asian countries, Pacific countries, also being forced into the same mess. A lot of the same things in TTIP are in that. You know, if you're from Africa, the economic partnership agreements, where the European Union has tried to roll this out throughout Africa over the last 15 years, getting rid of the preferences that African countries enjoyed and instead saying, you're going to have to sign up to free trade. That's the future. In Asia, the European Union and the USA and Japan and China are trying now to get all of these new agreements negotiated. So this is becoming now one of the biggest challenges to us because it threatens to rewrite the rules of the global economy in the interests of big business, in the interests of capital, and everybody else's needs come nowhere. And that brings me to my final bit before we sort of throw open to a bit more discussion and stuff, which is the politics of this. You'd think that there was hardly any need to discuss within the international labour movement that free trade deals like this are just bad, bad, bad. You'd think that it would be very easy to get a joint position of all trade unions, all trade union confederations across the world to resist this and to fight back. But actually that's not been the case. And I think one of the big problems has been here in Europe, where the top level of the European trade union bureaucracy based in Brussels has said, well, look, actually, we have a different view. We think perhaps for our members, particularly in those countries like Germany or Sweden, where they've got very strong export bases, it might actually be in our favour to support free trade agreements. And this becomes a real struggle between two different elements within the international labour movement. On the one hand, the instrumentalist approach, the instrumentalist industrial approach, which says, I, as a trade union leader, have to stand up for the rights of my members and the interests of my members. That's my role. I get a better deal from my members, and that's why I'm elected, and that's where I'm held to account. The instrumentalist idea. The second idea is the expressive idea. Expressing the higher values of the labour movement, particularly internationalism. And that says, okay, maybe it is better for, I don't know, a welder in Germany or some sort of industrial worker in Germany, of the aristocracy, the trade union elite. Maybe it is better for them if we have a free trade deal, because they will get better terms and conditions in their work. But look at the impact on workers everywhere else. We cannot stand up for a free trade agreement which is going to condemn millions of people to long-term joblessness, poverty, worse terms and conditions. And this has been a real struggle within Europe. Additionally, the European Trade Union Confederation, which is the bloc which represents the whole of the European labour movement, the ETUC has been pro-free trade. Every time it's had to come out on this, it said we are actually pro the European Commission's free trade agenda, and we want to try and, make it nicer at the edges because we want to try and introduce social clauses or social chapters which can make it, nicer. So, there will still be some rights left for people even when they've lost their jobs. But what's interesting now is that under TTIP, all of the European trade unions are coming up in opposition to it. I say all, it's not quite all. For those who are from Sweden and Denmark and Finland in the room, you will know there are still some trade unions in those parts of the world which are so wedded to the idea of free trade that they're saying yes to TTIP. But for almost all trade unionists in Europe, TTIP is now making them recognise what everybody else in the world has been facing for the last 30 years. And that's why we're very excited, because we who've always, War on Want has always been completely against trade agreements, we're really now because the labour movement in Europe is coming out strongly against TTIP, and we hope against all of the other free trade deals. Because if now people are beginning to understand what it means, then they can see what it's already meant with the massive deindustrialisation, job losses, and the massive attack on workers' rights across in the rest of the world. There is another book which unfortunately is currently only available in a hardback copy, which I think is £100. So this is not to do with us, this is to do with the printers, the Routledge. which has got a whole lot of studies in it of how different trade union confederations across the world have responded to free trade agreements. So interesting studies from how Korea, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, a very, very strong confederation, has been militantly anti the free trade deals, even while the European Trade Union Confederation can't join with you in that. Doing an EU-Korea deal. They said, we can't join with you because we're actually on the side of the European Commission. So there's some nice studies in here. As I say, it costs £100 at the moment, but if you wish, I can send you the PDF because I was one of the editors. If you don't tell anybody, because I think Routledge is making enough money out of the libraries it wants to get these things for. So there is still movement there. But I suppose what I want to do is I want to close with this. For us, a lot of the problem of facing up to these free trade agreements is that when you win a victory, you just wait for a couple of years and it comes back again. So we, for example, in the 1990s, oh yeah, TISA was a good point. In the 1990s, we had one of these victories when they tried to get all these powers through the multilateral agreement on investment through the OECD, and a big movement sprung up around the world. We defeated the multilateral agreement on investment in 1998, and it was wiped from the slate. A couple of years later, it comes back in the WTO, so we have to come back again in the WTO. We won. They had to take all of these agreements off the table. They then realised the best way to do it is one by one, bilaterally, pick them off, divide them up against each other, and then you'll be able to get them through. And that's what we've been facing now. But this new generation of trade deals is going even further. As well as TTIP, the transatlantic one, TPP, the trans-Pacific one, and all the others. Bert's just reminded me, because Daniel was going to speak about this were he here, TISA, the Trade in Services Agreement, is another of these mega deals which has been taken out of the WTO. It involves 50 countries worldwide, and that's saying on services we need to go further. We need to have more privatisation, more reach for the private sector, and more guarantees for transnational corporations that they can never get these things back into public hands. The problem for us, when we're always reacting, we're always in that position of resisting, we can never reach to the type of politics that would end this for good. And that's why for us, yes, we engage in these campaigns. Yes, we engage the resistance to try to build popular understanding of what's at stake here. But we need to move to the next level. We need to make it a political challenge which says, we're fed up with always having to say no to these type of policies which are rubbish and just give all the power to capital. What about the world that we want to try to create ourselves? And that's all of the alternative models, whether it be in terms of national sovereignty, like in Latin America, whether it be in terms of food sovereignty, like the worldwide movement around La Via Campesina and peasant farming, whether it be the international labour movement, the power of capital and global supply chains and everything like that. These are the types of politics we need to build towards a better future. But for us, you can't get that unless you have taken some form of political power in your own sphere. You know, we can cry about our government as much as we like in this country, but until you've actually challenged it and overthrown it, you're not going to see any difference. So for us, the battles around trade are incredibly important because they set the rules of the global economy. But we're fed up with having to say no all the time. We want to say yes and get to an alternative model that away and says workers' rights comes first and transnational profit comes nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for a very clear explanation of what's at stake. I'm sure there's a few questions from the floor, so can I see some hands? Yes, madam.
Two questions. What I find...
Who are you? That's the first question.
I find most striking, and this is the last point that you were mentioned, that the governments are actually giving up their own power. So if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because not all governments are really kind of having 100% neoliberal agenda. So if you could say something about that, because I find this striking. I mean, every politician, even though they're pro-capital, somehow they think we are significant. Okay, so they give up this right. Then the other point would be just a question for clarification. If you say now this is like the EU, it's the community of European governments. For how long is it planned to engage into these agreements? Is there, I mean, just to know this, I mean, is this somehow renegotiated? You say it's staying on forever. And what happens, if you mentioned the example of Slovakia, if you have another government, if they say, well, we are not responsible for what the previous government signed up, we are just resigning this, we are just getting out of this. So if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, I think that would be great.
Can I see the hands again? So I'll do like 3 at a time. So let's go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah? So who was the second cab off the rank? Who was number 2? Number 2. Who was the number 2? Who was the second one? You just had your hand up. It was you, sir, wasn't it? Yeah, go on. Your question.
My question is that there is a
Name?
well, okay, I'm Tilak. I'm from Nepal. We have been, experiencing participating in different social movements that go on around the globe. For example, War on Want and other different. There are Amnesty International and human rights and women rights, gender rights, child rights, many more. But there is always gap between trade union, global trade union movements, global trade union organizations, and those kinds of movements. Do you think there should be some linkage between these organizations and the movements to build more solidarity, to save our nations, to save our sovereignty in the countries? What do you think about it? Do you have any such examples, in particular in any kind of, maybe anti-privatization issues, or maybe any kind of activities you have? Can you give us some examples?
And the third one? Who was the third one? It was you, was it? Yeah, sorry.
Yes, I'm Rebecca from Sweden. I'm wondering, you mentioned that a couple of the trade union leaders in Sweden don't take a stance against TTIP. In Sweden, a lot of us have been very angry and actually hostile against this trade union. It's just not one. We also have in our government, there's one minister who also is pushing towards this TTIP agreement, and he has also received a lot of criticism since he's a social democrat. But I'm wondering, the trade union leaders in the UK and in Europe, have you shown your criticism and disappointment against? I don't have to lie. It's the metal union in Sweden. Have you shown your criticism against the stance that they are showing in Sweden? Because that is what we need. We need that other trade union leaders in other countries actually are pressing them to actually think and realize what they're doing.
Okay. Would you like to answer those 3, please, John?
Sure. My question?
I do, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let me take them in order. Why do governments give up their own power on this? I think this is a very profound question, and it goes to the heart of late capitalism. And basically, when you come to a late capitalist society, it becomes almost like an article of faith, an unwritten rule that everybody has to sign up to, that the interests of capital are the interests of your country. And for those of you who come from the European thing, we've had an experience in this country from Ed Miliband, had been the leader of the Labour Party, versus his brother, David Miliband. Their father, Ralph Miliband, wrote a very good book about all of this. Their father was a Marxist philosopher who basically wrote a lot of good stuff, which was exploring how the state and capital comes together in the late capitalist societies. And he said, yes, there are always tensions, but the idea is that they work in partnership. I can give you just a concrete example. We went to the minister who was responsible for TTIP in this country before the last election, and we said to him, look, what possible argument can you give us as people in this country? What possible argument could we have to say yes to this? And he said, well, it's good for business. If it's good for business, it's good for everybody. And I think that's the thing which has gone really, really deep, but that's a bigger discussion in that respect. Are they open-ended, these things? The bilateral investment treaties that were put in the 1980s and 90s often had a closing date. So that's why India has torn up its ones, South Africa could tear up its ones, Indonesia's done the same. But these new generations are being called living agreements. The idea is they live forever. So this is now saying the future is going to look like this. And that's why it's so scary. You don't get it back. And what you're saying about, well, could I be elected tomorrow and say I don't want to play with this? No. Because these treaties trump. They're more powerful than your national laws. So you can put in as many national laws as you like, but you have to abide by the treaties, because treaties are more important than national legislation. Are there any examples of where we've managed to build greater solidarity? Yes, there are, definitely. The work which we do, for example, I don't know if anyone here is from Bangladesh or Sri Lanka? Ah, good. So the work we've done in Sri Lanka, for example, with the free trade zones and general services employees union, which we usually call FTSGZ, because it's easy. But that is really important. You know, a very, very strong union doing incredible work there. And by linking up with the trade union and saying, okay, it's about getting more rights for the women leaders within that union, also within the Bangladesh garment sector, which has obviously been very much in the public eye and people's consciousness. Again, building the links between trade unions engaged in the struggle on the front line, and then acting in solidarity here. Because one of the things we're always told is, yes, we as a Bangladeshi trade union or as a Sri Lankan trade union, we can confront the local representatives of capital. We can confront the factory owners in our own space. But power exists with the retailers and the brands at the top of the supply chain. So our role here is to confront them. So on a day when you might have a strike or actions in Sri Lanka or in Bangladesh or in China or in Honduras, wherever we work in those partnerships, we will also engage in actions on the streets here in Britain or in Europe and confront the companies which are profiting from those local conditions. The bigger challenge, I think, is to build that international solidarity at that top level and really try to move it up so that every time there is a crisis like that, the entire global trade union movement can work as one and put pressure on. And it was interesting, in the wake of the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013 in Bangladesh, Industrial did coordinate a really good, strong response which said, right, for the first time, we want to rein in, we want to curb the power of all of these factories and the transnationals who are profiting from them. And together with the Bangladesh Trade Union and the entire global movement, we managed to force all the brands to sign up to the Bangladesh Safety Accord. And the Bangladesh Safety Accord says we want to have inspections of every factory to ensure that this disaster can never happen again. So that's one example of where perhaps it has worked better, but I think there's a lot more to do to build on it. And have we called out the Swedes? Yes. I went and this booklet, which we've done with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, so it's been translated now into 13 languages across Europe. One of them is Swedish, which is a bit strange because, in fact,
Which language did you use? So he obviously didn't get it.
well, apparently it was in a good translation into Swedish, but I wouldn't know. And we presented it to them. We went and we had a public debate with the woman who is the economics advisor to LO, the big confederation in Sweden. And they said, we are pro-TTIP. It's not that we're just sort of critical but on the fence. We are pro-TTIP, despite handing over so many powers. And we've continued to do that. We don't tend, and this is maybe a cultural question to talk about, we don't tend often to have public criticism of between trade unions in public. And that's why we're always told, you know, you can mention these things amongst friends, which is why I'm talking it here, but we don't tend to go and attack the ETUC in public. We don't do that. And so that's why they're allowed to sort of get away from it. LO is in a different position because within the European trade union movement at the moment, every 4 years there is a congress. And that congress is taking place this September in Paris. And as we speak, all of the confederations are coming to their decision. What are we going to say about these trade deals? In the 2011 Congress, they said, we are for free trade agreements, we are with the European Commission, and we support them. 2007, they said, we are for free trade deals, we are with the European Commission, and we support them. And our question now is, what the hell are you going to say about this? And apparently, the situation is that all of the other trade unions are saying we must say something stronger against it, but the Danes, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland are saying no, we need to be for it. And that's where it's happening internally, but, you know, I leave it at that.
Right. Now, 4, 5 and 6, you're number 4.
For Paula, and from Ireland, and it kind of leads on nicely from that that response about Sweden. And I think it demonstrates like the conversations we've been having over the past couple of days about, you know, social partner and social democracy and those type of deals. Once you understand that, it's perfectly understandable then why the ETUC and why unions would follow that kind of tack. So that obviously means that we need to strengthen that political alternative within our movement. And the question I really wanted to ask or focus on was the Greek no to the referendum. Like, this is kind of fractured open. It's shockwaves right across the trade union movement, the political left, the Labour Social Democratic parties in particular. And I think that this will create a really interesting response this year, because they cannot get away from the fact of like the social vision of what Europe is supposed to be about. I suppose I just want to ask, how do you think that the people power that was expressed in Greece, how can we relate to that, harness that, and bring that energy and spirit back in, and amplify that shockwave back so that we can, because I think that Oki was really the start of building the alternative vision of what we want, because there's a clear no saying we definitely don't want that, and TTIP is a representation of this bondholder behind the closed door deals of destroying our countries, our societies, our relationships, and all of that.
Yeah, good question. Who was number 5? Yeah. Whoever, I can't remember which one it was. Who was the 5th? Go on, be honest. Off you go. Go on.
Yeah, both of you.
You had your hand up.
I follow the discussion of food security in the UN's Committee on Food Security, and recently you've noted all the time there are few key governments who are trying to bring WTO agreement and rules inside the discussion on the discussion and policy documents on the food security, and we are trying to oppose this. But recently WTO had a kind of agreement with the FAO on food security, and this is really worrying us, and we don't know anything about this besides a small article on the FAO website. I would like to ask whether you know something on that, because what we are trying also to do in this Committee on Food Security, because it's the only UN committee stakeholder where we, as civil society, equally negotiate with governments and private sector and other UN agencies. And we are trying in this committee also to not only to oppose some policies or like WTO agreements being signed inside of the policy, but we are trying also to bring new topics on discussion. For instance, we are with Via Campesina, we are trying to push for discuss inside the committee trade for food security. And now when we saw, it's like they are trying, when we ignore the WTO, we try to keep it out outside, even that it is inside somehow that few governments try to increase. But at the same time, they saw that we are bringing this discussion to discuss. We said we want trade in our way to discuss, and that will bring the food security, not the other way around, because WTO failed. There are still 1 billion or 100 people. There is World Bank also failed with all these problems. So we are trying to say that this is not working. and we are concerned what is going on. We don't know if you come and
Yeah, right.
we are prepared.
Right, I think we get the point, yes. And the sixth, that has to be the last one. Yeah, the last one. Oh, were you the sixth? I beg your pardon, Dan was the last. I'm sorry. Sorry, comrade. He did have his hand up, yeah.
We could have a seventh, maybe. We could have a seventh.
All right, we'll stick you in it. Well, yeah.
I just
You have to
want
be
to say
quick.
very briefly that the effect of these agreements is not really a matter of speculation but of experience, because we have a precedent, which is NAFTA. And the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was the first, and which has had disastrous consequences in Canada and the United States and in Mexico.
Definitely.
Right.
Take the seventh one.
And go on, the last one in the seventh.
All right, my name is Peter Damo. I'm from the Federation of Independent Trade Unions in Education in Romania. My question is the following. You were saying that the ISDS component in the TTIP would allow the corporations to sue the national states somewhat or somehow beyond the national legislation. My question is this. Before what kind of court? Which will be that authority? Who will establish it, or what forces will establish those courts? And what would be the legal method upon which they would judge?
Yep.
Okay, very clear. Right, John, could you tackle those, please?
Let me go through the issue about what people power can achieve after having seen this amazing achievement in the weekend in Greece. It's very interesting because this morning Alexis Tsipras went to the European Parliament and he was booed, he was attacked by a lot of the European Parliament members, and you've seen some of the German members of the European Parliament from the Social Democratic wing. From the Social Democratic wing, Martin Schulz, who is the president of the European Parliament, attacking the Greek people, attacking the Greek government, and he is a Social Democrat in Germany. And it's utterly extraordinary that he should say that the Greek people no longer have a government which represents them, even when they've had this type of call. So it makes me very angry, and I think, it leads us... I'm really looking forward to the discussion next about the relationship between the trade union movement and the social democratic parties, because I think that's a really key discussion now. If they're going off in that type of direction, that's a massive question. But I think the people power can achieve a lot in that respect, and it can achieve a lot within the trade union movement. The TUC in this country, very, very open on this, have always been pro-free trade. The TUC has always said, and the International Department will say, we are pro-free trade. But as a result of every single one of the trade unions in this country going to the Trade Union Congress last year and saying, we want you to be against this, the TUC has a policy now of outright opposition. It would never have come to a policy of outright opposition to TTIP unless there had been that pressure from below. It's 100% clear. So we know within our own movement, it's that type of pressure which makes the difference. The second question about the FAO, I don't know specifically about this, but I'm afraid I have another bad example where they did the same thing with the World Health Organization, the WHO, several years ago. The WTO had heard that the WHO was going to come out with a new document showing the negative effects of free trade around the world. So the WTO stopped the WHO from doing this because they got the US government to threaten them with withdrawing all of their money. So the US government said, you cannot bring out the document you're about to bring out. They had to withdraw it, and they did a deal with the WTO to rip up the criticism and have a new joint thing between the WTO and the WHO. It sounds as if they're trying to do the same to the FAO, because wherever there's a threat to the principle of free trade, more power for corporations, they slam into it. But I don't know, and I would certainly like to follow up with you to learn about that. NAFTA, definitely. NAFTA is the absolute prime example. The trade union movement in Canada, in the USA, and were all promised that NAFTA was going to be fantastic for them. Bill Clinton, remember him? He went off to try and tell the AFL-CIO, this is going to be fantastic, 1 million extra jobs. The result, 20 years later, because we can now do a proper longitudinal study of what the result was, exactly as you say. At least 600,000 jobs lost. The Mexican trade unions were promised it's great because they might lose them in the States, but you might get them here in Mexico. What did Mexico experience? The minimum wage is now 1/5 of the value it had in real terms before NAFTA, because all of the high quality jobs in Mexico were wiped out. All of the campesinos, all of the peasant farmers producing food were wiped out. 2 million of them lost their jobs. And yes, a couple of jobs went into the new maquila sector and immediately went straight out again. Because when China joined the WTO, all of the jobs which had gone into the Mexican maquiladora went over to China, and so that was happened as well. We need to be really clear about this, because they come back again and tell the US trade unions that TTIP is going to be fantastic for them. And still, the AFL-CIO has not come out against TTIP. You know, you think, how many times do you need to learn these experiences? In respect of this very, very good question about, you know, how do you set up for a system where companies can sue governments and get away with it? The traditional way in which you do it, and this has also come through NAFTA, is that you appoint 3 arbitrators. It's a tribunal system. The company who is suing appoints the first of these. The government, which is defending it, appoints the second, and those two together appoint the third. But they don't appoint judges. They appoint corporate lawyers. They appoint trade lawyers, some of whom have actually represented the corporations in previous cases themselves. So it's already completely biased, and it's an inbuilt prejudice in favour of capital. They take place behind closed doors. There's no public opportunity to come and see them. And we now have over 600 cases we know about which have shown that in the majority of cases, either the corporation wins or they have a settlement whereby they're paid off before the thing comes to its final situation. The Romanian case, I'm sure you know, the Micula brothers, which is an extraordinary one where...
There is another one with the Bechtel company.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are astonishing things you can read. There are some examples in here. Also, another thing we've written on this, there's lots more examples. Countries across the global south have been hit time and time again by this. But the interesting thing now, which we need to remind ourselves, is it's so obviously wrong to have these secret courts with people who are not proper judges and with no jurisprudence, so no learning from case to case, that they've now got a reformed version. And the Social Democrats across Europe are all signing up to this reformed version. Particularly the Germans and the Italians and the Romanians are leading, the social democratic groups in the European Parliament are leading, telling everybody else this is okay. We now have a reformed setup, and we're saying we don't want your reform. The principle that corporations can hold us to ransom, the principle that corporate power and profit takes precedence over democracy and our sovereign rights, that's what we object to. So when they say, oh, it's okay because now we're going to open these courts up a bit and it won't be the corporate lawyers, it will be proper judges, and there will be a right of appeal, and you might be able to bring your own amicus briefs to them, we don't care. We don't want to give these corporations extra power. We want to bring down their power and actually take back power into our own hands. So be careful when they talk to you about the details of the reform of it. Remember, the principle is this is a battle about power. And that's what free trade is. It's a battle about power and who will have the power in the future to dictate how our economies and how our societies are run. It's a big battle, and that's why we have to win it.
Well, John.
I'm going to stay for the next session.
Oh, good. So we've run out of time, unfortunately, but you've heard John's going to stay around. I'm sure he'll be happy to talk to you about any questions you may ask. Well, that brings us to the end of this session. Would you please give a round of applause to John Watson?